Hello everyone, today we talk about Medievistics. Many of you ask me for titles of books, of works, of sources, of any kind that can introduce you to the world picture. I often reply that the important is not much the specific, especially scholarly reference. Mostly if you really want to start to study the Middle Ages, you should do so through historiography, but really concentrating on the value of the sources. This is not easy to do, so in parallel you should at least acquire certain familiarity with the general picture of the scholars to, if anything, understand what at some point the limits of these interpretations were, how our understanding of the Middle Ages came to be what it fundamentally is today at a broader level. Today I will not digress too much on the usual, people today do not know. Of course, it's always the same old story. And for a purpose that, in fact, is often inverse, at least in the outcome, compared to what most people would expect regarding older historiography in particular. Because everybody says, what's an updated, recent work that you suggest, etc. First of all, as you should know, and especially following me, as I'm quite vocal about this, we are really going through a moment in history that is one of fragmentation, right? Of essentially hyper-specializational dispersal, which probably is going at some point soon to be stiffened by the emergence, at least, of some more, some renewed perspectives. I can be considered, for example, in a generational sense, essentially the product of it. I was raised and educated properly in that later sort of 20th century perspective and early, of course, 21st century perspective, mostly coming from previous generations, that is after World War II, in Western context, where basically the entire sort of modern and secular perspective was given me as the moral and scientific objective standard. I cannot even complain, and I must not complain about this, because, of course, there is, as I always say, the idea of modernity, and this is very eloquently demonstrated by studying Medievistics in a sense, is somehow made up, right? And many people, especially from the conservative side of the aisle, move away from, let's say, higher culture in general, academic education, and generally speaking, an interest towards humanities from one side, stereotypically because these have been, at least at some levels, in particular in certain places, hijacked by some kind of Marxistic, materialistic worldview, and objectively they suck. I come from a place where, even though that mechanism happened, actually the quality of the academia was good, right? Even sort of, leftist or liberal professors were not actually bad in as much as they had done their homework and they knew what they were talking about, and it was rather in their private sphere that you would understand they were leaning from the side of the aisle. I know that in other places in the world, it's not, also within the West, this has not been the case. And my intuition is that basically, as we are running out that 1968 generation and pupils of that, scholarly speaking, there's going to be a coming back of some more traditional worldview that, for example, I came to learn through my further studies that were much more and bigger than even the ones of my, at some point, top humanistic faculty worldwide by QRS ranking. Actually, was the one when I got in the year I got my PhD, for reasons that I think are obvious. Like, we are looking at history as if it was just, some sort of formal technical training. There are people who believe, especially coming from, I will not digress from this, but there is a sort of tagging, meme, identity, political culture, especially in the United States, that has somehow been crammed on or in this sense passively but gladly received this idea that everything can be reduced to some absolute category that does not require an individual's effort, if not within the tracks set by somebody else, so that if you mechanistically cite and copy from people that have published a certain book in the moment, that's the highest pure gold that you can find, and so you are okay where you are just by those incredibly relativistic and narrow standards. I come from a background where, let's say, the concept of culture was truly elite, not much in the sense that, I come from a poor country or one where society cannot afford a substantial education. For me, as fundamentally upper middle class, it was easy to get even without. My great-grandfather was, for example, an academic, but in medicine, right? He did something completely different. My father is a doctor. My mother basically had a bachelor. And in as much as this, I was the first person who got a doctorate, at least in the broader range of people that I knew, aside from my grandfather. And it was relatively easy, even though, again, the institutions that I attended were some sort of pretty consistent ones. So my understanding that especially history is a matter of a broader cultural, and so literally from colo in Latin, etymologically, like a properly relentless cultivation, and some effort that must come from so many disciplines as possible, obviously individually handled. Like, you cannot study. I mean, history is truly the queen of science and of subjects, academically wise. But of course, it is because we pick and you must master these fields like, theology, philosophy, even scientific, so-called hard scientific, in fact, sciences. It can be. I had, for example, in high school, a scientific education mostly that helped me tremendously, especially as a military historian, but not for the technologistic or materialistic bias in general, but the actual methodological meaning of science and what this means also from a heuristic point of view. And among my, I can say regrets, because it's not even a thing, I was very scornful towards, the establishments, the professors. I'm a person who apparently has a lean towards rising up through the ranks to eventually reform the system. I was quite polemical. I risked to be at some point I was a good student always, but at some point, if I hear a mistake, if I hear a misconception, etc., I'm going to tell you in your face. And so I risked pretty serious things disciplinary-wise throughout my, not just at university, but at school. So meaning that it was an older thing. And of course, at university, it was much more a problem. And as such, I fundamentally believed, because especially young people in their early 20s do so, that scholars were at large wrong by some degree. And I've always sort of developed this sense by reading other people's work, and especially the more I was advancing in mine, that there was some flaw, there was some limitation. I'm like this also in other fields, also in literature, in art. I very much love, classical music, or also pop music. I play the guitar, etc. But let's say the sense is, in many ways, that there is always a deficit of some sort. I've never been satisfied since I was little, for example, with the adults' explanations of things, right? They always seem to me inconsistent. They always seem to me, at least, rigged by some subjective perspective. And my ultimate purpose in what I do, also in Schwerpunkt, is to seek an objective reality, right? I can say I can arrive to the truth, but I really care about, also in my work, the methodology, because everything gets down to do your work well in order to assess something that cannot be attacked fundamentally. And my experience was, in fact, throughout all this, at all levels of the ranking, basically people living in their own bubble and basically feeling threatened by any idea that is not, let's say, within their very narrow field of understanding, not just of specialization. And so I've also developed my polemical attitude further that you're aware of on Schwerpunkt. But one of the regrets that I had in that sense, which I must say is also connected to the limits of my specific academic experience, which, again, it's supposedly the highest you can find in the field, is the fact that we have hardly been presented. We were hardly being presented during the standard university curriculum with specific historiographical history, all right, with figures of scholarship. At least our professors were quite good. They knew what it was, but they coped with us in this transgenerational dimension. Like, okay, these kids do not really know anything. Let's at least teach them the basics of certain concepts. Let's expose them to some sort of broader criticism, explaining how things are always more complex and nuanced as they can be. And I don't know, they didn't even teach us how to cite, because today it was so basic that it seemed like an insult to even telling us how to do it. And of course, you would learn during your thesis. That's what you have in the first place. And in some ways, it was hard. And I left, especially, eventually I started immediately at the end of my master, the doctorate, and at that point I was a bit more on my own, fortunately, also because in my field nobody really wrote anything meaningful. And so I had the opportunity at some point during those years of research to really focus more on scholarly figures and understanding more or less the importance, at least, of browsing them, even in a cursory fashion, to understand what was this whole thing about. And eventually, mostly through studying history of religion and looking at the actual beliefs that people had at the time, I realized the importance of studying the history of historiography for the sake of understanding exactly how that belief tied with the, in fact, actual vision of history was expressed at the time. And so I've taken a greater liking to that. One of the reasons why I don't like history of historiography is that I hardly ever follow. People never really had specific heroes that I wanted to emulate. I'm a path maker, and I don't care about following somebody else's footsteps. If anything, I see even this some of these scholarly figures, of course, I revere in my own regard, but mostly as allies, as tools, right? As means to the broader end that is, at the end of the day, more universal than it seems. And one thing that especially struck me is how, by studying older scholars, I realized that most of these guys that you hear mostly only in today's kind of style of academic divulgation, when such a thing even happens, or at least something that is pseudo-academic, like as we were looking the other day with Kings and Generals concept, alleged misconception of feudalism that they didn't understand themselves. That, first of all, like in that case, modern and secular people do not, they have psychological, existential, emotional issues with the concept properly of tradition, of authority, of virility, in a sense. And so the concept of objective truth as at least an end of research is something that makes them hydrophobic in a sense, and incredibly, in this sense, contemptuous towards older figures. Of course, there are some figures that got things blatantly wrong, but aside from the fact, in the past, like people still do today, but aside from the fact that older historians, we will see now, were naturally operating with means that were incredibly scarce, and that with which today you wouldn't really be able to do anything on of what these people did and how they did it, especially. I mean, in the Middle Ages, there were people who knew the Bible by heart, right? And the obvious reason for that is that they, the same parchment or even paper. Paper was much more easily desirable, but the idea is that things cost, right? And the power of the mind was much more exercised in so many ways that you can immediately see from the finesse of a special of a particular historiographical interpretation. Naturally, with the fall of tradition, the spread of mass society, and so again of anti-traditional ideologies that were to some extent sold to the masses as if they had been more or less traditional still, but mostly with the contempt towards the elite, properly with the aristocracy, Many of these notions have been properly, first of all, removed from actual curricula in basic education, because with mass schooling, people imagine the force of that by quantity, all right? You teach people like a very cheap, superficial set of anecdotal notions that eventually came to constitute, I don't know, for example, a national feeling or understanding or memory of some sort that had practically nothing to do nor with the means nor with the standards that the establishment had before. And reflect on that as also those, for example, those Anglo-Saxon conservatives that say, I don't know, we should just study economy or science because we have to make the money. Elite traditional aristocracy. In Europe, as in the United States, for example, back in the day, the founding fathers was, aside from, again, the various differences in places and age, were actually very versed and primarily versed, and especially military leaders, people that had emperors, like people who had a strategic command, were primarily educated in the classics, were primarily educated. Of course, it was for the sake of warfare, but objectively, what's the meaning of or the relevance of antiquity without Alexander or Caesar, really, at the end of the day, or Hannibal, Pyrrhus, etc.? This is something that also in the modern age continued for a great while. It's mostly in today's society, in the last generations, people fundamentally do not understand properly the concept of leadership, of command, of discipline, of self-sacrifice, and what was really basic to all these people for generations, again, up to the ones of our grandparents, even when, again, adulterated and or blended by the aforementioned sort of post-traditional ideologies. But there is another fact that deeply impressed me, is that on top of this great individual traditions and studies, etc., again, some conceptions were really wrong, again, in ways that today can't be presented, because we know so much better, at least under a generally systemic point of view. Today, you can't really access something that is much more uniformly standardized in terms of information and accessibility to that. But the consequence of their education was was the one of such an intensive intelligence that even though a concept, a 10% of their ideas may have been rigged because they hadn't tested them, especially in a very sort of more technical sense. For example, Köhler believed that, we're talking here about the basis properly of a medieval military historiography by military men at the time, so people who actually commanded armies at the end of the 19th century. The concept of, for example, that feudal battles between knights would be just individual duels, right? And that there was no order, everything was clumsy, etc. That derived, again, it turned from the Napoleonic bias. The emphasis is almost this post-traditional contempt towards an allegedly worse way of making war during the Middle Ages, which is absolutely nonsensical. Still, we're loaded for the rest of the 90% with an enormous personal culture and a certain level of understanding that is completely absent today. Not only that, much of that knowledge was actually more genuine and from the spring of that traditional wisdom than most of what is presented today, to the point that even though, again, we can easily gather more information today through our, fortunately, sort of serious and professional academic system, and again, worldwide academic system, and our communications, the digital means, all the internet, all what you can imagine in the interpolation of knowledge, its criticism, etc. This has become so easy, right? This quantity, this availability has become so has dropped so much in somehow expendability that people do not consider it anymore. I mean, they do not appreciate, as I was saying before, for example, the genuinity of a source, right? The broader take on reality, or something that you can't basically get experienced about just by relentless exposure, for example. So building up a veritable muscle that makes you understand how history practically works at all the levels of the Clausewitzian wonderful trinity. And that, by some degree, has turned towards something like, let's actually demolish authority, let's smear scholars, let's presume again that there is always some myth to debunk, some misconception to cancel, right? And there is no actually positive built up anymore, especially in a cohesive, comprehensive, diachronic, comparative fashion, which should have been, it was up to a couple of generations ago, really the basic methodological, but also cultural background of revered scholars. And especially in, again, I would say from my side, the continental European scholarship was always the best, especially looking from medieval history perspective, right? Which is, in fact, what we're gonna look at today. Naturally, as I was saying before, studying the history of historiography, especially about the Middle Ages, intertwines with a very contentious and, in fact, still unresolved issue. That is, at the end of the day, the one of our attitude towards tradition in many ways, and it can't be understood otherwise. So, talking about scholars and works, today I will try to stick to a minimum of criticism and general sort of deeper, beyond level of, say, why this scholar sent what, right? This is not a video designed to provide you with tips for, okay, read this stuff, because some of these works may have been truly, may be today truly obsolete in a sense. Of course, you can better study more updated historiography to begin with, but I think they are precious because they, first of all, give you an idea of the depth of the scholarly production, which is yet another very underrated thing. People don't read anymore. They do not read books as a whole, and it's useless to deny that. And so it's very difficult to presume that they have anything but some sort of hearsay, paste and copy idea of what scholars were actually about, with the consequent shrinking of probably not just the broader, say, awareness about scholarship and history of historiography, but the fact and the degree of the contextualization and the direct connection of this historiography with the specific cultural background of the era, the actual need of explaining why a particular historiographical perspective was really matured at that point. Right, and history, I think, is beautiful exactly because it does not put limits to this kind of knowledge. There is not, again, a ending point where you can say, even if you read all these works, like, you can fundamentally just understand more or less all of the picture. No, because in each of these works there is something to yet study again. It's not easy. Even studying a battle with, 20 sources from the 14th century, I can assure you, takes months of work. You can imagine browsing the entirety of scholarship, even just on the Middle Ages, and presuming to have any broader authority and competence over this. I care about the statement because, again, most people, especially the younger ones, seem basically disconcerted and sort of mentally enfeebled in front of reality, to the point that they cannot afford to accept that there is no such thing like fixed standards you can simply hang on, but you have to research for that objectivity that does exist only through hard, relentless work that you cannot buy for discount on Amazon to be shipped home, but requires, again, continuous and relentless work for decades and decades, if not the entirety of your life. All right, so let's debunk, again, any nonsensical notion that if a person reads a book is automatically enlightened about whatever the book discusses. Most people do not have properly the capacity of understanding the difference between reading, learning, studying, and more, right? And in general, like, you can easily see it. There are people who read their entire life and they do not understand literally anything about it, right? They stop to a very superficial level of understanding that as a consequence, unless they have matured in another field already, they cannot prospectively see, right? Even speaking of the aforementioned multidisciplinarity, cannot derive, not by elevating yourself in one field. Like, of course, like different fields produce very different minds, but unfortunately that is mostly the consequence of that hyper-specialization and the limits of those kind of people's accomplishments, so that we say that, again, that unfortunately it is so that philosophers do not stand with their feet on the ground. They don't even know what they're doing in the first place in researching. Engineers have mostly essentially at least a way of applying sort of their own essentially mechanistic and materialistic sake, especially of making things work to people, moral forces in the world, and obviously failing all the time, presuming that they can predict the system in any fashion. I would say that history is truly the queen of all sciences because it takes from all what actually happened, so not something definitely you can misinterpret at some point, but that is the product, at least, of what happened in actual reality. Right, it's not in a prefix set of parameters that you arbitrarily decide to feel mentally sheltered from the fact that the entire world is collapsing, and that you haven't the palest idea of how even to cope with that, which is all what tradition gets down to. But that, in fact, does not and cannot substitute the utmost glory of self-sacrifice in this holy combat of making sense of the world and coming to dictate its rule in the process, which is also, of course, what tradition really tells us how to do. History was, unsurprisingly, what Cicero said, like the subject that if you miss will make you remain a child for your entire life, no matter who you are, right? No matter what kind of discipline you are. If you don't know history, and you don't know it well in that sense, not reading a bunch of books pretending to be pseudo-historically sophisticated, which is impressively, again, how most people I've ever met on the internet tend to approach, sometimes even in good faith, like saying, is this enough? No, it's not enough. It's never enough. All right? And that's the beauty of it. It's a challenge. How far are you willing to go for that, right? I think this premise is crucial to our approach to Medievistics, which is actually an incredibly beautiful topic. As I said before, even not really being too keen on the broader subject, once you get to know that, you're really going to be fascinated with it. And first of all, there is the broader question to tackle, like, say, the realization that an ancient period culminating in the Helleno-Roman synthesis had faced a crisis beginning in the 5th century, coupled with the belief that a more direct and meaningful reconnection with its cultural and artistic legacy was essential, which is what essentially emerges from within the same Middle Ages, right, gaining significant moment among especially humanists and artists starting in the 14th century. Again, I made too many videos explaining how and why this started happening, but there is one thing you should always remember. There had never been, up to that point, any hint whatsoever that the Helleno-Roman and classical antiquity in general had ever come less as the standard of tradition for anybody involved anywhere around. I mean, the medievals had truly, and in this sense, the humanists, because people sometimes think, oh, the humanists, look at these this hypocrites. They hated the centuries before. They created the misconception of the Middle Ages, of the Dark Ages. First of all, it's not really true, and to some degree, at least because some concepts that were created at the time were hyper-loaded eventually in later times, especially during the Reformation, with completely anti-traditional ideas that instead were largely shared still, regardless of their individual shortcoming. Re-senioralization, the courtly essence of humanism as a literary current, happened in the Middle Ages, right? This is yet, for example, a very underrated aspect, how much, for example, the so-called Ghibelline tradition survived within an imperial reality. When, again, this is the general center, and I can see it from not just from my studies, but believe me, being for several years on YouTube and making thousands of videos, mostly on these topics, that still today, at large, masses are essentially rejecting or refusing in some way the concept that there was an actually Roman Empire throughout the entire Middle Ages in the West, even before Charlemagne, and not necessarily just in the Byzantine part, that in fact would require some metaphysical kind of theology in order to properly understand. I do my best, let's say, to bring this stuff a bit more to the broader audience, but that is deriving, especially as a need of mine, because this is something that I found out that I wasn't being told. All right, I hate conspiratorial ideas at all costs, but sometimes conspiracies do exist. First of all, there's no doubt. It's likely, like the worst thing you can do is just forcing like an explanation if there isn't a valid one. But more than else, like people forget, and they really dilute the quality of the understanding of presenting things that, again, today we feel so high and mighty for teaching, and that, however, we completely misunderstand because we do not have the kind of beliefs that those people at the time had, right? This, I think that dialectically alone could be enough to emphasize the importance of tradition, because if you want to make sense of a historical time, unless you don't have, again, some, in fact, too often ideologies that are anti-traditional to the point of saying that basically the individual has no value and that it doesn't affect the system, that there aren't, that the system is inherently something, I don't know, environmental or predetermined, or that changes just for reasons that are not human, that are mostly material or part of or the consequence of the lack of control in such a complex system, and not, in fact, of big, not just in the sum of the individual choices of people, but the big political, financial, moral, cultural, say, achievements of civilizations, even when they are collapsing. And therefore, for example, by doing so, by having the previous idea that this is not what rules the world, de-responsibilizing people nowadays, which is all what fundamentally our system has gotten about. Even by self-styled conservative standards, morals are radically lax. Right, being conservative today is to be like a radical communistic terrorist, even just, I don't know, by the early 20th century, right? And this is the worst part of it, that people do not even know that, because of course they do not know what was actually believed at the time. And it is incredibly interesting to see how our own historiography has often sort of properly eliminated, consciously or unconsciously, even though there was a specific effort also properly from an anti-traditional, mostly Marxistic movement that took over a great part of university, especially after World War II, properly eliminating the entire notion of certain ideal, moral, traditional beliefs that indeed the communists a bit already did not understand, in as much as at least they had never had a meaningful space up to, in fact, the revolutions of the 20th century. And that at least at the time they could even know, because some of them had been actually schooled academically by some also the names we will see today. And that, however, they simply rejected to the point of inculcating their materialistic worldview, to the point that also their pupils and the pupils of their pupils to this point in history have completely forgotten what the entire point really was. That is to say that they succeeded in eliminating even the memory of that traditional doctrine that was simply faded away for many reasons, including the general collapse of humanity in terms of individual standards, that would forget the same tradition or would become more lax in the process. But that fundamentally instilled this idea that we are the better ones now, right? Because we know better also what, a humanist believed. If you teach, like, again, at the beginning of a course of medieval history, what humanists believe, and you still spread the notion that they were the guys who simply made up the notion that the Middle Ages were this dark period, that the gods were barbarian, but also in a negative sense. If you don't understand how their own same culture actually celebrated part of that more ancestral element, you cannot be objective. You cannot be a good teacher, right? If you don't understand, the Gibellinism of Petrarch, you cannot even blame properly the humanists and humanism from his founder in this case to have created what is, at the end of the day, a post-traditional secularistic and modernistic approach that we mostly developed like in the last generations. It's not to say, of course, that that tradition had not been forgotten along the way, or, as we've seen, corrupted or misunderstood, misapplied, etc. And this is also, unfortunately, as a problem increased by the fact that modern secular ideas have spread concepts like, that the Renaissance or the Enlightenment were purely positive dynamics that destroyed a primitive, barbaric past. First of all, without contextualizing, and secondly, without realizing that the foundation of the same ideas that effectively work today, surviving throughout these movements themselves, are basically shared, if they make sense, as long as they work with what was traditional wisdom. And again, it's very difficult to make people understand this. It's almost like, a lost cause. But I believe that if properly explained, if looked at through this, for example, history of historiography, can be definitely recovered. And I'm trying, again, my best on Schwerpunkt to point the reflectors, so to say, on this topic. The humanists definitely realized that there had been a post-classical, and so basically Catholic, that is universal, moment where, in fact, the empire and its heavenly dimension, starting exactly from the peak of it before the descendants, in fact, overlaps with Christ in 4 reasons that have to do, in fact, with the loss of force of mankind, for which a Christian approach must recover the more spiritual dimension of the world. This happened also with Zarathustra, it happened with Buddha. There are different expressions of this, regardless of the theological implications and the beliefs, etc., across cultures, right? This was a very widely shared understanding, all right? And in part, this understanding itself was deriving from a sense of shame, deriving from a sense of lack of achievement that instilled, or at least was the consequence of that pessimism in the incapacity of attaining salvation by oneself. And the humanists, if anything, realized that the traditional standards that they abided by and they attempted to revive, in fact, through the same classical antiquity, at some point had, and its recovery, or at least the recovery of its standards, because it's not like these people were blindly copying the classical past. If anything, as traditionalists, they understood that the past was different for a reason. There had been a accumulation of further sin through blood, through the generations, through the centuries. So, for example, that notion, if you're not aware of that notion and the fact that it was completely mainstream at the time and everybody believed it, and you don't even take it into consideration in a historical analysis, you're completely doomed in terms of any cultural interpretation can derive from that, all right? In ways that are sort of more in line with our own sensitivity, of course, what we realize, first of all, from the Middle Ages is that the empire had broken it down, all right? This had happened more or less all across the world. The Roman Empire, by Western standards, but also by global standards, had really been the best. In fact, in the broader achievement through probably the Roman nailing of that redemptional opportunity given in exchange as a munus, and the capacity of elevating anyone, if worthy. Other thing that we always forget about the empires, if the empire threw citizenship at random people for no reason whatsoever, was really over. That this empire had fragmented, that everything had broken down, and so the Middle Ages had basically to realize that, and they all had always known that, but began to conceptualize this in times that also are not much the fruit of a collective reflection, but that in humanism, I made multiple videos on humanism explaining partly this, were actually the product of a new crisis, right? The one of the late Middle Ages, that did not bring to an end of medieval civilization, but actually fostered further. In this sense, there's the positive element of the Renaissance through humanism that, however, was a very elite phenomenon, numerically speaking. It was mostly tied to the courts, to some sort of subservience. Most of these people, to rulers, most of these people, it were very intelligent, effective people involved in a sense in the courtly affairs, but that were not, for example, the citizens, magistrates, commanders of the previous generations, right? And in that moment of contraction, it was definitely perceived. That's why Petrarch, right? It's not a random thing. It's not somebody woke up in the morning and decided that this new concept had to arrive. This was being reflected upon because, in part, medieval civilization had reached a new peak, right? That seemed to be universal. The other day, I made a video about Frederick II that very much sort of expresses, again, that last, for example, mention of the Sol Invictus and sacred royalty in an actually heroically attainable fashion. The medievals had been aware of this failure once again, and so they doubled down on the reflection on what the hell was going on amid the plague and people and society seemingly falling apart because there were major uprisings, rebellions, again, population contraction, etc. In realizing a bit in this sheltering world that, as you know, is a bit like when autumn comes, right? And you want to be a bit more withdrawn and warm at home, reflecting, and the shorter evenings in front of the fireplace and so on. To let's say, okay, let's look a bit at the past. Let's try to understand what actually happened in this. Not maybe the eye of the storm in the moment, but in this moment of apparent decline and sense of reflection, of contemplation. This is really typical of humanists that realize just through a research that was getting, in this sense, ever more theoretical, meaning people before learned history, but in ways that were much more tied to the actual replicability of those actions, right? The Carolingians would, be sung the Nibelungenlied because in practice they were to emulate what the Burgundians did against Ezio's Huns. That had also an historically real thing, and all mythology basically revolved around attainable standards happening in the past. The humanists were not doing this. The humanists were not commanders, were not rulers, were not... They had properly been severed from those positions. And in general, in the refeudalization of Europe post-crisis, most people had basically given up even their right to, not to arms per se, but in great part had been demilitarized. Society had become more subservient to rule. In order to make things work better for that new temper, right? If, the option is either this or collapse, well, they would fight to stay afloat because some still traditional bulk would have still been maintained. So this happens again in the 14th century. So we're looking at almost 1,000 years after the fall, at least, of the Roman Empire in the West. The centrality of Rome is crucial throughout all the Middle Ages. It's something that did not find any boundary. Most people today think as if, people in Northern Europe did not care, did not know, because they had their own parallel system. But it was straightforwardly understood that there was a center of the world, there was a sacrality that revolved around it, and that the probably imperial power stemmed exactly from that source, that spring. That's also why the crisis had been so painful, because as you know, both the papacy and the empire quite declined in the process. They basically turned into some sort of regional powers rather than broader universal ones, even though technically they were, formally speaking, they still were exactly there until the 18th, the 19th century. So it's picture this when you study Medievistics, because Medievistics happens largely by our own today's historiographical, in fact, in turn, acceptable standards after the collapse of these traditional systems. So something that looks similar to some degree, especially to the Renaissance, right? Of course, we were rising in terms of absolute force with a spread, again, of mass society that if you dilute that power is not really that performing in individual sense, but it's as if like in the 19th, starting from the 19th especially, think about Romanticism, right? The study also, the attempt in recovering tradition that was, again, pretty straightforwardly explicit if you study the philosophy of that era up to throughout basically up to World War II, right? And again, in ever more explicit ways, because it was understood by many that was properly what you had to stick to in order to save the system. Is exactly the same effort coming from understanding what that traditional world had been about. And so you can understand the world Medievistics, as we conventionally understand it today, as fundamentally having its roots in this specific dynamic. What, of course, started polluting waters in the process is the diversion from the same tradition per se, right? So there were some cultures that and social milieus and politics that tended to preserve more that kind of idea of tradition, right? And speaking of humanism, that was mostly a more straightforwardly traditional concept and ideology, if we can. It was very complex. It indicates lots of things. But at the root, at the core, especially of Italian humanism, that is a bit the standard there. Everything was in line, in fact, with the recovery of the past. We were talking about it recently also in the videos about Medici and Florence in the 15th century. Its art, we'll talk, if anything, better in the video about Lorenzo the Magnificent. But the greatest issue actually occurred with the Reformation. I mean, the great crack, right, in tradition, the biggest one, and I was talking about this also in the video interview with Veritas and Caritas, is not much the Enlightenment. As, again, you've been told, as if there are many conservatives today literally thinking that, I don't know, before the 18th century, everything sucked and science arrived and became better, right? That's literally how many people think. But in fact, in part for some reason, obviously because of the Reformation, in that background from the Anglo and eventually like the rest of the right, also American culture, the idea that the Reformation was a major disaster has been somehow skipped, right? It has been somehow exorcised and especially used to blame further what was the spring of universal tradition, right? It's not like the Holy Roman Empire during the modern age is particularly celebrated or the papal role in Europe particularly considered. As you know, I make lots of videos about, the Habsburgs, the Poles, the Italians. We really look at that side of this sort of crescent that also coped with the Ottoman struggle, and so interreligious warfare made really lots of videos about modern crusades that, in fact, were not just a novel thing or a different thing from the Middle Ages, but straightforwardly the same, identically universal struggle that was evidently believed also from the other side. The problem is that the demonization a bit of the Middle Ages, or especially the dark reputation attributed to it, became particularly evident in the disputes of 16th and 17th century Protestant reformers who criticized the dominance achieved by the Church of Rome over the Middle Ages. And so basically, given that Rome was obviously spiritually hegemonic over the entirety of the continent, whether you like it or not, and yes, including towering over, the Orthodox world, and having, by the way, and it's a pity, really, especially for, again, the today's mostly culturally dominant Anglo-Saxon perspective, because the Anglo-Saxons were a triumph of Roman Catholicization. Right, I made lots of videos about this topic, and it's something beautiful in English history. England has a veritable Catholic tradition that lived on, as you know, also in some crypto fashion. Just last week I made a video about the English Civil War at Similia, and that in fact has not turned England into some radical, some of the most radical Protestant form. As you know, the Anglican Church maintains still some Catholic elements to that were part of tradition, and so it's literally that tradition that you want to look at, and that indeed is also at the root of the great successes of the English, the British people in the modern age, right? There's no doubt about that. You know, that I never want to give the impression that I hate, for some reason, the Anglosphere at all. I'm a great admirer, even as a historian. I developed greatly thanks to that, especially as far as military history is concerned. Then you also start making distinctions, because you see, for example, that this other part of Europe has not quite been really appreciated. Think about the Dark Legion against the Spaniards, right? If, today, in the 19th century, it would have been a major Spanish empire of the same level of the British. We would all be fixated with the Spanish tercios and the Italian wars, the great commanders of the Iberian Habsburgs. Today, we acknowledge, of course, that role. It's not like it's been hidden at large, right? This is not so popularized or considered as other topics that passed through eventually the British filter, right? And so if, the French had won the 7 Years' War, at this point we would be all fixated with French stuff. We would know much better the history of the French colonies. It of course would have become more important at that point in the process. We would have had a completely different set of cultural references, just for saying how malleable history is and how much something so straightforwardly anti-traditional, anti-Catholic, in fact, was nurtured in a broader global and popular scale through the fact that, again, Protestantism took over Britain, hence the British Empire, the most advanced world today, to the world, right? And this is the moment, early modern history in historiography, where really the Black Legion on the Middle Ages was properly forged in the more straightforwardly conventional way, in a time where it was considered ridiculous and laughable in the papal curia to burn a woman for witchcraft. And while, you still could see that in 18th century New England, and true, of course, means that were not guaranteistic like the Inquisition. That was by far the most, just and guaranteistic and legally based and procedurally serious tribunal existing in Europe at the time, and in the world likely, as opposed to, again, anything that could happen normally in Protestant countries, where accomplished the fact that at the time were not even yet that developed at all institutionally wise. You could be simply taken and burned at the stake in the moment if you were unlucky enough to have caused that. And of course, witchcraft is also something connected with tradition. I'm not saying, not witchcraft, this sounds bad, but it's burning people for the sake of witchcraft. It is something that people don't know, for example, because of these prejudices against the Catholic Church existing in the Roman Empire, existing in all the great Catholic empires, because of course you cannot say at that point that the Roman... Why do people today, when I say that the Roman Empire in pre-Christian times was a Catholic empire, do not know this? Because of course the great Roman Empire mirroring the British later, could not be considered as Catholic. Right? Why it was traditionally as straightforwardly as Catholic as it could get, as the entire Indo-European theology is Catholic. And again, people don't fundamentally understand even what that reference means. It was born in this time by people who were talking about the Middle Ages and making up this distinction because they were absolutely paranoid and phobic about any kind of authority and traditional order, etc. Consequently, this view, and again, it's mostly Protestants' Dark Legion's fault that this view gave rise to the concept of a media ethos, so a middle age situated between the ancient world and the new or modern era. Again, it had already been spotted. The medievals were absolutely aware of the fact that they were not in the middle of anything because the future had yet to happen, but that from the Roman times, things had sort of gone worse in a way. Again, with in some cases, literally a flipping of traditional values, this idea of prosperity that was supported surely by positive things. Again, even in Protestant powers, success, power, wealth did actually derive from the works, in spite of course, the denial of this by the same traditions, because there was some good in these cultures and societies, etc. And so you can understand how, of course, it's not much a national matter, which is yet another thing it was enforced at the time, but rather a matter of elite, of establishment. Lots of people may not understand anything about these topics, even during the pre-Reformation times. That is essentially just a mean to an end, right? In reality, admiration for and emulation of the ancient world had never waned, as we very well know. Rather, the intellectual and literary endeavors of the Middle Ages, which were dominated in the West from the 7th to the 12th century by ascetics and clerics, consistently positioned themselves as an extension and commentary of late antique patristic writings, and through these writings, as well as independently, on Helleno-Roman culture. Yet, within this framework, it was seldom acknowledged that through such commentary, the Latin-Germanic world creatively reinterpreted the ideas and creations of ancient Mediterranean peoples and cities, adapting them to its own turbulent historical context, but in some cases also reinvigorating those same views. For example, the Indo-European ancestral beliefs, through facts, as a consequence of the migration era, the injection of the Germanic element from the Barbaricum in Latin society. And so actually being able to reconstitute, even at some point in the broader collapse of the system, some islands or levels, at least, of traditional understanding that became, in fact, more, let's say, indicative, more identificative of the pinnacle of the great medieval civilization, right? The same Middle Ages, again, are a product of that overall collapse. Most people work for the knights that are the only ones that sort of maintain those heroic traditional standards that were upheld in the classical world, and this feudal culture at some point, and also others that were in that sense more similar to the republic and the civic system. Again, the Italian communes that in part contributed, in fact, to stamp and but also to that feudal element, but also in that sense bolstering the same medieval civilization as a whole. We discussed this also as far as, for example, the empire and the papacy. Before, these universal powers were thought to be part of one single power, right, of a single monarch. But even in that, the tandem was more functional, right, than any other place in the world, because basically the Byzantines sclerotized by subjecting the church, and so the priestly aspect to the, just an autocracy, basically. The Arabs basically do not even have a clergy proper, and they think that they can attain things that they can't attain because humanity is sunk, including themselves, and so they actually fail against the West. So when you look at the apparent, again, the fragmentation or dysfunctionality of the medieval West, this is, first of all, a more functional system than the ones around. And secondly, and again, I discussed this especially for the early Middle Ages, that may seem the time where everybody says, how, that was terrible, look at the other civilizations, were more advanced. Were they? Be extremely careful in saying that. What are you looking at? What kind of indicators? What kind of pictures there? Because we've been a bit blinded by that too. It's not to say I don't know that the Islamic civilization was not successful in those centuries, but by which degree compared to the Latin-Germanic system, right? How did the entire Islamic world actually work, or even how did the Byzantines fare compared to the West, etc., and how to explain what happened in just a few centuries, like what had happened really to the West. Had it simply collapsed, right? There is very often, even in those Philo-Byzantinistic kind of attitudes that betray actually very often Russian propaganda or sympathies or anti-Western hate, but sometimes it's always the same. It's actually an hysterical alienation from the reality of that society, of the reality of that system. You think that it was actually better to live in the Byzantine world as opposed to the Latin-Germanic one, especially the post-Roman one. I'm not claiming, for goodness sake, I don't know, that the Sweden was better than Constantinople. I'm not going as far as that, of course, but mostly like the post-Roman is truly Western system. That's something I've had several tens of hours to discuss, or even more actually, about, because it's hundreds of, at this point, if not thousands, because it's not really supported by historical evidence. And so historical evidence is different from what people want to believe or wish to believe. But this is exactly, and unfortunately, what methodologically was installed at this point in history. Right, and there is also a further sort of Western-centric idea that turns out to be self-sabotage. Right, if there is a real Western centrism, is the hyper-critique towards, again, authority within the same West, because most people who criticize authority are ignorant just to see, just a palm from their nose, and without even, of course, understanding much of their own same Western identity of civilization or meaning of the same. And that, in fact, began to talk the history of the Middle Ages as a dysfunctional history. I mean, truly, if I get on, I don't do it anymore from several years, but if I get on Facebook history groups, if they are still a thing, there's a general sense of iconoclastic desecration of the concept of medieval society. I mean, medieval society was so much better than antiquity. Really, I mean, do you think that a person, I don't know, in the 13th century was living, worse than a person, I don't know, in the 2nd century BC? How do you think it actually worked? Have you ever started to think beyond technology? That most people don't even understand how it was actually applied throughout history and in these pre-industrial societies, for that matter, because we reason in terms of industrial standards through those patterns. This is, again, something you must be extremely careful in assessing, right? And especially not getting fooled by, because let's be honest, the reason why people believe this stuff is they have heard it somewhere. It's not like they matured it upon some deep understanding. It's the way the Middle Ages were historically presented, or at least more or less pseudo-historically presented through culture, through movies, through video games, through poor education, from scarce parenting, and it's impossible to deny it, considering the average understanding people may have of history in any sort of consistent fashion. This original aspect of medieval civilization is very, very important because it shows the prote-form phase of tradition. There isn't such a thing like just, you should just imitate the past or simply go back to the past. You should be the most with the means that you have now, and understanding that is the true key to the transcendence of the same. The recognition of the originality of medieval culture gradually emerged in the later centuries of the Middle Ages, in fact, coinciding with the formal establishment of Romance and Germanic languages as vehicles for literary expression as well. Right? Masterpieces of medieval literature that are able to pick like the past and expressing themselves in ways that are definitely a product of the fall, but it still revealed the deep awareness of what the traditional system of reference was actually about. We always discuss this on Schwerpunkt. And again, it's something that we can consider ourselves to be part of still in 2025. It was precisely this sense of divergence from the venerated biblical and classical models, combined with the expansion of literary and intellectual activity from the ecclesiastical elite to the chivalric and mercantile aristocracies, which were especially dynamic in Europe's newly established or revitalized cities, that ultimately led to the characterization of the centuries following the collapse of the Roman Empire as a period of decay, again barbaric and decline, and truly understood in that anti-Catholic direction, meaning that the barbarians were primarily understood as destroyers of the system. That is incorrect if we pick, let's say, the eventual integration, especially of the Germans in the system, and the flourishing, in fact, the same culture within the Romano-Germanic West. But there is no doubt that for Roman, Germanic, Hellenic fault, the system had definitely shrunk. Just like, this was very evident. We made multiple videos about the Byzantine Eastern collapse during the Islamic invasion. Why did that happen? Right? There is always in tradition the notion that you are essentially responsible for anything that happens to you, even if others perpetrated it, right? Because where do you draw the line in terms of capacity to withstand that, right? It's incredibly important. It's the only law that matters, in fact, the divine one, right? And so the medievals, that did not despise, of course, for example, the aforementioned biblical or classical models at all, but were in fact using them as a guide and appreciating, in fact, what up to that point the same medievals during the generations had managed to salvage, to reflect upon, and in this sense, understanding that wisdom as a very valuable element. Also recognized for this reason, looking at the different standard, the incomplete civil recovery of the Middle Ages, right? And it's not like, again, they hadn't tried, right? The Ghibelline tradition, Frederick Barbarossa endowing, for example, the studium of Bologna in particular, with the Habitat Constitution to represent, to recover and reintegrate at least the Roman law in the previous, in the now existing, in fact, legal systems, was all part of that attempt to reunite East and West, to fully hegemonize once again Western Eurasia, Europe, starting from Europe and the Mediterranean, which largely partly happened. We explained this in multiple videos. In the same years of humanism, for example, after the crisis, still, Europe was the stronger power out there. The Europeans had dominated the markets all around Western Eurasia. The entire system around that we often understand as a look toward other cultures, other systems. If you compare them, you realize that there was no other engine and power like the European one at the time, and especially the Western European one. Again, there's no doubt by any kind of indicator, right? And it hadn't been an accident. The fact that we ourselves, for example, fixate too much on this equation with the Dark Ages, and mostly talking about the early Middle Ages, and studying less the high and the late ones. How many videos I've made about the migration era that are more watched than the others, right? Even though we cover the later Middle Ages, people do not seem to care about civilization, about development, about power. Instead, these were obviously understood as the proof that this medieval system had done something correctly and that even surpassed, in fact, other cultures. And by the way, Westerners were incredibly self-confident about this. If you study their literature, the way they, for example, describe other peoples, how they approached other cultures, do not reveal actually much amazement. They find it relevant, they write it down, they describe it, they do not comment so much, but they go on and they treasure that and they work with it, right? And it's a very important Western character in that regard. So despite the gradual development of this predominantly negative view of the Middle Ages, that, as you understand, has different layers to it, it's not univocal, it's not also of the same intensity, there was also a keen interest in its historical events, right? Medievistics was born in different ways through humanism, exactly because not just there was a civilization that had historically been widely literate and heavily literate, like the medieval one already was. There had always been histories about the past and the present, by the way, with an enormous chronicling tradition. But there had been also, like always, an understanding that if this broader perspective had to be recovered, it definitely necessitated of some attention towards the past, the recent past, which can easily be seen. Again, I don't know if you've ever studied humanistic or Renaissance works, essentially using medieval sources, sometimes of just the couple of generations before, in which terms, first of all, you get an incredible perspective on how much society had changed across the mid-14th century crisis, but also what kind of scope humanistic historiography had. Again, not as a random movement, but literally the transformation of society, the consequence of that crisis, right? A refeudalization of the system, an increasingly large elite power in relative terms, and in fact the subsidization of specific courtly scholars that were to write a narrative that in many ways, as you know, is also, say, enlightened, but wasn't quite stemming for the much more fluidly as reliably straightforward and sort of out of experience one that, I don't know, an early 14th century city chronicler could have. Because that guy was involved in literally all the levels of politics, warfare, and society of his system in first person, while the latter was just literally, the humanist was literally looking from the window, right, of what was happening and was really not going anywhere, or being so central in that whole system. So again, it's important to interiorize how much also this attitude that as modernists we seem to have as, I don't really actually know what's going on at a higher level, not much in a first-person sort of lower sense, because, of course, who wrote was still an important person, not the average guy who, I don't know, like today saying, I don't know, just because you go to war, you understand anything about that war, right? Many people actually firmly believe to some degree. And von Clausewitz himself that was at war definitely tells you how much of nonsense that is, and people today take it as some sort of an attack to the military, the veterans, from Schwerpunkt, seriously. Let's forget about this, but it's truly a problem, all right? But this sense of, okay, let's abstract a little bit to try to explain things mostly as an impression or as a forced narrative because we have to write it, as opposed to actually being thoroughly informed on the topic. This is a very, very serious issue, right? And so there is also, of course, a Protestant attitude to this, because again, the Protestants do something very similar. It's not like they were particularly elevated in a broader cultural sense, or they came from backgrounds that had pioneered civilization, literature, culture, whatsoever. But they had to instrumentally write about the negativity of a Middle Ages hegemonized by the terrible Roman Church, so much so that what is still believed by many that have to stop people from commenting sometimes because of the mere nonsensical fanatication, like that heretics were champions of free thinking, right? They were the good guys of the story, that the Cathars were great people, and that fundamentally also there was a broader heretical movement against Rome. When you don't contextualize the Cathars and see also how the Valdensians were completely okay with burning at the stake, and as they were being persecuted themselves by the Church of Rome, and how actually many evangelic papistical movements, including the ones that had actually more heterodox but not openly heretical character, like in that case, actually largely believed that Rome and the papacy had to be the center of the West, right? Remember this, that in many ways, modern historiography, at least from this Protestant background, tended to also isolate national perspectives, to insulate properly the broader realization of which was the most advanced, the most performing, the most effective civilization and were in history, to basically cross out Roman history or papal history as anything relevant, right? Sometimes I make videos on even very important topics. The other day made the one on Frederick II of Hohenstaufen and the siege of Rome. And I don't know, normally I receive lots of views, and this thing, it's a secondary topic, like you're not really interested in that. How can the single most central events in medieval history can be sort of dismissed in such lazy fashion? It's very difficult unless you have a clear picture of how this cultural perspective, as subjective and as relative, is so deeply ingrained, sometimes even probably in the most basic modernistic references, how much this is, of course, overlaps with nationalism to a degree, with socialism. I mean, if you want to center the attention on your own country, you want to just talk about how people plow the land, right? Obviously, you're alienating further from reality, but by a great deal at all levels here. So these things had definitely began, also as a consequence of the crisis of the Middle Ages. Again, there was a heavy civilizational destruction in the process. It is not to say, by the way, that, again, those who held the authority were not responsible for that. Absolutely. I'm absolutely, like, from a Catholic perspective, on board with that. Otherwise, by traditional wisdom, they would have not lost that power, right? By divine grace, they would have held the imperium, and everything would have kept working like before. But this was also the broader problem. Like, humanity constantly spirals down. This is what the entire classical world was aware of, very well aware of. Now, by the mid-15th century, Biondo Flavio of Forlì, in his Historia ab inclinazione Romani Imperi, produced a comprehensive, chronologically structured narrative based on his scholarly investigations of the preceding European millennium, emphasizing the central role of the Church of Rome and the Italian urban world. Right, so you see, a humanistic perspective definitely is not critical of Catholicism, definitely not critical of the centrality of Rome. In a broader sense, Flavio Biondo is buried on the Capitol Hill in Rome. And by the way, here the obsession, for example, for the blondness, the thing, because he actually was. But look at Botticelli's paintings in the same period, right? There is a reconnection with the Apollonian, with the classical, what we explained, for example, amidst lots of controversy regarding how the Romans themselves attributed, for example, this blonde characteristics of whiteness, of fairness to the race of heroes that dated back as a memory, of course, of the Indo-European migrations and conquests that people today seem to be phobically hysterical towards, and that they cannot afford to seemingly accept. And this was a guy that, again, wrote, is a very famous northern Italian scholar who was rival with Bruni, for example, that had some sort of more wealth vision, for example. He worked for Florence. And so there still a Ghibelline wealth tension. As you understand, he's actually very universal in traditional diet, and was able to write an entire comprehensive, like when we read Historia, we're normally counting as, as the, Levy's ones, as an entire sort of work divided in different volumes. Each ones were the actually books, like the libri. And this were titled Ab Inclinazione Romani Imperi, which means literally from the inclination, from the downward tilting of the Roman Empire. Right, and yet it was not like you would find in this, for example, in the Gibbonian perspective, like the idea that it was some sort of dark decadence of sort of values, of morals, of the genetics of the culture. On the contrary, and this is obvious because by the mid-15th century, Italy was particularly advanced. Biondo Flavio was an expression of that. And he could not but see the central role of the Church of Rome for how Rome already was at that time, which during the Middle Ages wasn't at all a decadent place, as people really think in general. And the Italian urban world, the great communal civilization that had basically pioneered together with the Frankish, the French one, later the broader at large, had peaked the greatest achievements of the broader medieval civilization. And I don't know if you have ever heard of, again, Blondus Flavius is one of the most famous humanists, and we will, if anything, read a bit more from him in our videos about the topic. His sources primarily consisted of chronicles, legislative documents, and prominent epistolary collections pointing to a history centered on major events and influential figures with significant authority, in line with what? Obviously with the traditional model provided by the great annalistic tradition of antiquity. Livy, again, was also being properly as philologically recovered by all these students of classical Latin, etc., that reached incredibly high level of education and cultural background in general. And they were born cultured, because still the medieval society had produced in the elite always that level of higher culture in a way or another, even though, of course, it changed formally, as we were explaining before. But at this point, you see that, for example, humanists were not at all people who were trying to undermine, for example, the Middle Ages per se, and what was remaining of the Roman tradition within it. Nor they were shying away from the fact that history is about the most important people, the most important events, wars, right? Blondus Flavius was, for example, studying Dante's letters, seemingly talking about his participation in the Battle of Campaldino, for example. And there was a general interest, therefore, towards great deeds, as they were actually seen at the time. There is all a pre-humanistic or proto-humanistic literature as well that at some point we will explore. If you, for example, look at 1 century before, or even slightly, say year more back in time, the work of Mussatus, right? The guy who wrote mostly the fabricated bit, the Black Legend in that case of Ezzelino da Romano that we covered as one of the early signori in northeastern Italy. Mussatus was a wealth, but was a man of radically high education, like a guy that would write, literally as Livy did, like the entire warfare of early 14th century Italy in form sometimes even of verses, but in a perfect Latin, or just a Latin that had to be yet fixed, but not in the sense that it was a bad Latin. It was actually very complex and developed and Livian and Virgilian in mold, just bent to some medieval literary logics, not because these logics were more primitive than the classical Latin itself. You read this stuff and you say, but when is it really that humanism started? Right? Even if you read 12th century Latin, as we do, for example, from our French sources for the Crusades, from of course clergymen mostly. That's actually pretty good Latin. It's coherent. It's mostly like also a limpid narrative. These people had a great clarity of mind, a great sort of intelligence. It's kind of obvious. They weren't trying. They were just doing so, and better than most people do today, without any trouble, not just in Latin, but just in basic writing. This is for saying that, again, even reasoning just in terms humanism began at a certain point, is falling into the negative cliche of the Middle Ages, where classical antiquity wasn't studied on a regular basis throughout all Western history, even the early Middle Ages, right? There are so many myths about that, including, again, the part we will see now, the fact that the Renaissance was born out of, Byzantine refugees bringing Greek manuscripts to Italy. But do you realize what Westerners were doing already by the 12th century? Namely, knowing already which manuscripts they needed and where they were in the East, where nobody was actually using them for the same purpose, and bringing them to the West just to give a theoretical clothing to the already scientific development that had surpassed by that point. People would translate from Greek, Arab, Hebrew. Do you realize how overwhelmingly advanced, not just in absolute terms, but relatively to Byzantine society or Arab society of the time, these people actually were? How do you think that the Byzantines or the Arabs lived? People were literate, and everybody was studying things. They were autonomous people venturing to find books somewhere else. And guys, this is big and important, because you have no idea how many people I've met, like any person fundamentally that I've met to some degree, and unless they were agreeing to what I was saying, was literally thinking only this version. I mean, if there is a version spread among people, it's mostly that one. That, again, the West in medieval times was just a dark pool of ignorance and backwardness. And guess where does this information, this worldview, this historical idea come from? Right. It is, you see, why it is important to talk about historiography, because we can pinpoint the exact moment in time when this was fabricated. And again, it wasn't the humanism. You see how much we blame the humanism to say the Middle Ages were bad. Which humanism? Which ones, actually? Because humanists at large were praising the Middle Ages. Or at least giving it a dignity that was the same one that they understood in the broader seriousness of the fall of the empire and its deeper reasons, etc. The people who started going schizoid about the whole thing were the Protestants, sometimes in up to 300 years after humanists, also just in terms of actual literary development. That is not a joke across Europe. Flavius Blondus, again, is a very interesting figure. He was born in 1392 in Forlì. That was a vibrant hub of Romagna's civic culture. Biondo was shaped by his early exposure to the humanist circles of Venice and Florence, where he served as a papal secretary under Eugenius IV, gaining access to ecclesiastical records that informed his historiographical ambitions. All right. And influenced by Petrarch's call to revive classical ideals, Biondo sought to trace Italy's historical continuity from the fall of Rome, which is also an incredibly important awareness of the Italian national identity that already at that point was actually very advanced just by written. How many times have you heard that, again, Italy was not a thing until the unification, or at least the Italians did not understand one another? I mean, in the Renaissance, or even before in the Middle Ages, it was a vernacular that if you read, if you know how to read the original texts, is straightforwardly, I mean, not just Dante from Florence, it's literally the Italian as it was modernly spoken. But comparatively, again, a place like Romagna, where Blondus was from, like how do you think they wrote? They wrote another language? Do you think that they didn't understand each other? I will not digress, again, on medieval Italy, because I have made so much, and we'll come back on this again. But for example, awareness that at some point it had been the Romano-Italics that had literally imperially lorded over the rest of Europe and the Mediterranean, which is something that today people do not really understand in the making of the empire, that is at least preferentially taken in consideration as some sort of multicultural blob where there was no racial, cultural, or ethnic or national difference. I mean, these people understood history better than we do, right? But they understood it not because they had, again, extemporarily recreated this out of some weird model that tilted towards that direction. It's that they literally knew, also in a meta-historical sense, I mean, just out of sheer political, military, and social evidence, what it meant for example, for the Romano-Italics to have conquered the world at the time, and just like it was happening at the time of the Treaty of Lodi that we were talking about the other day, in fact, in the video about medieval Florence, would mean for a semi-united, at least a politically cooperating Italy to be in front of, for example, now a coming back France after the 100 Years' War, the Ottoman advance from the other side. So these people understood things in way more straightforward ways than we do, because even though they were somehow sheltered as privileged people maintained by great lords, etc., as you see here from Blondus' biography, they actually traveled a lot. They saw things. They saw different cities, different states. They studied different languages. I mean, Petrarch had been, as you know, an imperial and papal ambassador. He literally lived in Bohemia, in Avignon. He was from Tuscany. He eventually lived in northeastern Italy, etc. So we're told he traveled the entire Europe, searching in the cathedral chapters for libraries, manuscripts that he greatly, loved, but also used effectively to reconstruct some works of the past that had been partially lost, like Cicero and at least some works, etc. So, would you be able to do such a thing? Would you have, even in the 14th century, just by your own view of the Middle Ages, any other thought of but surviving, in a sense? Admittedly, Petrarch, again, was a relatively privileged individual who could do that. But, again, would you have had the same entrepreneurial spirit in that? Where he was a guy who loved comfort and loved tranquility and ended up living across pretty turbulent times. For this very reason, it's further remarkable that Blondus sought to trace Italy's historical continuity from the fall of Rome, viewing the church and city-states as heirs to Roman grandeur. Right? How often do you hear of this perspective? Ever? Right? I made lots of videos, for example, about Italian communal armies, and historiography is finding out that basically these were the biggest, the most advanced, the most active armies in the continent, and nobody today talks about that. Why is it the case? Why? And we all know that it is the case, so to just check the historiography on the subject. And I'm not being rhetorical here. I'm really specifically referring to the existing works, the existing articles, monographies, etc. Attention. Check the Oxford Encyclopedia of Medieval Warfare and check which kind of battles are listed and which not. How many sort of booklets or stuff are dedicated to a comprehensive organic study of that macroscopic military topic. Here for Blondus, that again was unaware of how lame eventual historiography would have actually been, was pretty straightforward in telling us that, yeah, there is an obvious continuity between those things. Because again, these people also traveled. They knew how other countries really were. They knew their own history. It was, generally speaking, a matter of basic culture among the aristocracy in general. Aristocracy here, it's also a cultural elite, right? But we're talking about some sort of, not even gentry, something higher in the also mercantile aristocracy or something like that. Again, even mercantile is not a proper term, but you understand what I mean in these urbanized centers. To know what history had been about. Again, this notion that, history was not known in the past, or that they had a primitive understanding of this. Well, of course, they didn't have our general historiographical refinement, but the ways it was conceived. This is before, you see, most of what we criticize, as I was saying before, in the contemporary terms, is these historians from the 19th century believed this, and before you would expect it was not even a history, or that it was not an objective or accurate history. Here we have people that lived in a very concrete way in that same history that we would like to know, that are literally telling us how things were. On top, by the way, of chronicles of stories that they eventually had read and known better sometimes than even modern historians, as they had interiorized them. First of all, they had more recent events that were of more common knowledge, and again, it's a myth that history was not known, especially in these places. Naturally, I don't know, if you look at, again, the aforementioned, still 15th century Sweden, a Swedish hinterland, let's put it this way, it's not like many people knew too much about history in a sophisticated sense. But even there was a proto-humanistic tendency that at least some scholars and part of the nobility roughly cultivated, right? So it was pretty straightforward as an obvious. Think about the same Norse sagas and how they have been written down. It was just part of traditional society to to treasure and to cultivate a specific knowledge of the past. There was mostly also specifically about that. It was not another abstract theme, and mythologically speaking, the gods essentially descended into the man, right? And so the history proceeded fundamentally in this direction. Mostly they saw themselves now as humans, and so something increasingly deteriorating, but it was, the greatest amount, the only knowledge that they had, in a sense, because, as we said before, through history you can learn everything, was history itself. And what we see here, for example, in Renaissance Italy is just some more advancedly and refinedly modern, secular, positive way of doing that. So still on a traditional track, naturally having lost also part of the most archaic and central aspect. We will not go back talking about how, Livy would see archaic Rome and how it was in turn influencing guys like Blondus 1,500 years later, right? But also reflect on how much people intended each other across the millennia, literally, as we still do. If we read Livy, if we read Polybius, as we were talking about the other day in the video about Roman Roman warfare sources and scholars, we're talking essentially of very similar people to us. They are literally talking to us, not in riddles, but straightforwardly explaining to us what actually happened, and everything they say seems to be perfectly matching with a coherent and plausible reality that, by, of course, confronted with all the rest of historical evidence available, turns out to be overwhelmingly objective and straightforwardly correct, right? Describing reality as it worked at the time in ways that today we're just able to speculate, conjecture in an abstract way. Those people lived through that. They knew how it actually was. So much so, even when they were more secluded, a bit more contemplatively living, right? Because it was a matter of such obvious importance that everybody became informed by that in a way. Blondus' approach is also largely reflected in the Storia del Regno Italia, written just over a century later by Carlo Sigonius of Modena, another northern Italian humanist. This was the first systematic history of the Italian kingdom from the Longobards era to the communal period, though it remained strictly bound to an analytic structure as well. It's not like this wasn't insightful, right? But in many ways, this is how the same humanists were habituated to conceive most historiography on the basis of Livy. I mean, Livy could be dramatically insightful, even following an analytic structure. In fact, it's not like Sigonius' work is just a list of events, right? There were some medieval annals that were actually just like that. Maybe, in the High Middle Ages, at the time of Charlemagne. Not even. If you look at, for example, the Italian historiography of the era, you realize that from the 14th, from the 12th to 13th century, things had gradually evolved, since ever, through that analytic structure to become, obviously, as a history in chronological order, and saying, okay, this year happened this year happened that, or something more complex. If you read Villani, for example, here we're not making, as you understand, medieval historiography, but the history of Medievistics, right? So we're looking at Sigonius, and this guy was, again, a very cultured individual. He knew his deal. He was born in 1524, so literally 1 year before the Battle of Pavia, not even. He was educated as well in his birthplace, that was Modena's scholarly environment, and he was very influenced by his teacher Francesco Porto, who was a Greek emigre who instilled in him a reverence for classical historiography, particularly Livy and Tacitus. This is very interesting, by the way, because we know of Byzantine refugees. There definitely were also sometimes. Think about Cardinal Bessario. We've seen him also involved in some events of Rome, the plot of Porcari in 1453, etc. These were very educated people, because the Byzantines had, at the very top, let's say, of the courtly environment, certain, at most, provincial ultra-elite. Of course, their own scholars that knew their deal. It's not like these were illiterate or whatever, but indeed the environment where this enormous historiographical production could boom was a Renaissance Italy, right? The Byzantines did not really do that. I mean, they had chronicles, of course, themselves, but they weren't so comprehensively interested in giving, for example, a new profile to most of the works that had been already written and treasured as part of most of a Byzantine tradition rather than anything. It's a slightly different approach. And by the way, these were the Greeks that had decided to go over to Italy that were somehow more fortunate than those who remained in the Ottoman Empire, that also sclerotized the sort of historiographical picture further, right? In the West, we did things better, obviously, but this was true also before the Ottoman conquest that was, as you know, installing itself in the wake of essentially the Byzantine empire and power. And you understand that this Greek emigre loved Livian Tacitus a lot, right? He was Italianized now, had an Italian name, as you've seen. It's also incredibly interesting that Sigonius would choose the history of the Italian kingdom from the Longobards era to the communal period, as it reflected what had been spotted also by Blondus and other scholars, the awareness of institutional, national, cultural continuity within what was in fact one of actually the most important kingdom of the Holy Roman Empire, given that it was the one to which traditionally, especially in the heart of the Middle Ages, the imperial crown was delivered and so connected to. You could be a leader of the Western Franks, of the Eastern Franks, but if you had the Italic crown, you could access the imperial one. That was, however, a necessity. You could not wear the imperial crown without the one of King of Italy, right? So there was, since Charlemagne, of course, and also here the history of Longobards is quite fascinating, a very big deal of awareness, again, of this origins. But if you read, I don't know, early 14th century chronicle, like the one of Giovanni of Cermenate, you realize that this guy was a Milanese. By adoption, he came from a nearby town. And a notary, who was also mayor of Milan during the time of Henry VII, it was a very interesting period, wrote a history just out of his personal culture that was extremely famous at the time, explains a big deal of things about Milan. And aside from the fact it's a beautiful work in and of itself, there is an extraordinary introduction which was made, and it's very interesting also to confront with other, say, as a general practice with one of other historians of the time, that goes as far as saying, I don't know, we Lombards descend most from the Gauls, then the Romans came and were the Lombards. I mean, this guy had an idea that the world had been mostly like a classical imprinting, and of course the Cisalpine Gauls, what was at some point the Lombards, would become, right? So there were different changes, but he identified his Milanese Lombard upbringing as some sort of separated from the rest of the peninsula as a whole. And still, he understood to be Italian. Throughout the whole work, he explicitly states that. But it's interesting to see how they would condensate, especially at the beginning of these chronicles, going chronological order, normally from essentially either the creation of the world or again particular historical events. How, in fact, all these historians would cram together incredibly complex topic, and how they literally saw the beginnings of the world in their own view, and how that made sense in the world work with the current events. This is what really strikes you from a scholarly perspective. Something that may seem a natural inclination, like I want to explain, I don't know, if I'm starting to write a history of kind of everything, I'm also simply going to, of course, imagine how that very far past, about which I don't know too much, would actually have worked, right? But the most interesting aspect in this sense is how concrete the vision already was about certain things, how there were some foundational understandings that eventually are the ones that informed our historical view. Because as we explained, before modern science came around telling us that fundamentally history is materialistic thing, right? We study what happened not in the basis of a broader anthropological meaning, but essentially how much you can date things with carbon decay. People had certain not simple beliefs, but conceptions to live up to that were fundamentally political, historical, cultural, right? This is what, generally speaking, tradition had been about, and how much it still worked in the mind of those who founded Medievistics. That, again, people tend to mostly not think as the actual humanists that we randomly mention, not much as historians, because, I don't know, have you ever heard about Sigonius? A very famous name, right, in Renaissance historiography. And consider that Italian at the time was the language of modern Europe. So basically what these guys were writing was informing the entirety of Western Christendom, and with that, basically the world. And most people do not even understand this. I mean, I get people that, oddly enough, send me emails asking me which language should I learn to study European history. And you may want to try Italian before, I don't know, Spanish, for example. Like, if you want to have any kind of understanding about anything, right? Italian, in this sense, in the Renaissance, becomes the third classical language. Once I was asked, which are the first two? Because, of course, knowing Greek or Latin is, who does that, right? What kind of purpose is there to history? I've met all kinds of people who reason like this. But again, ask a Sigonius in practice why he would deal with, for example, Lombardy and Italian communes in a broader history about the Italic kingdom. And you have there an incredibly straightforward answer to much of our Western foundational history, and later what became eventually the same Medievistics. All right. As a professor at Bologna, Sigonius' access to municipal archives allowed him to craft a narrative that emphasized the legal foundations of Italian civic governance, aiming to legitimize the autonomy of city-states in an era of growing foreign influence. It's not like these states did not have a law on their own, but there is a sense that, like also in the late medieval and early modern period, cities become ever more central to specific, to the broader governmental sake of the bigger powers out there. Here basically the Papal States, but indeed, aside from Rome, basically Bologna in the Po Valley was, again, the second most important city. And one, as we've seen, also a great juridical tradition. This is the place that, as we remembered, had witnessed to there was the legal capital of Europe, and had witnessed to the revitalization of the same Roman law. And so with that, also those classical philological standards that were used to study Latin, right? I made some videos about the spread of Roman law as common law, basically, in the Renaissance, as you know, in the West, right? We talked about the Mos Italicus, we talked about this context, we talked about Spain, we talked about France, even Germany. And so, again, if you wonder who these people were, and why are they so important? Not some random names of random cities. Well, just know that there is a deeper meaning to this. Other big name, the oratorian Cesare Baronio, right? He published in Rome between 1588 and 1607 as a series of his. Naturally, we're burning here the entire chronology because there are so many other Renaissance authors that are worth discussing, but the Annales Ecclesiastici by Baronio are also a quite important branch of of historiographical genre that is ecclesiastical history, this unknown. I may be the only one who's made hundreds of videos of history, of Christian history, and routinely getting less views than other stuff, but you understand why that is important, right? It's not a mere partisan attitude. It's literally answering the question, how the hell can you even presume to understand medieval history if you do not know, say, Latin, study ecclesiastical history, but well, not by wishful thinking? How? I mean, seriously, let's be honest about this. This offered a documented, this Baronius Annales Ecclesiastici offered a documented chronological account of ecclesiastical authority as well, not mere history, like a story, like some kind of weird, meaningless list of events, as most people think history fundamentally is, but of ecclesiastical authority from its origins to the 12th century, which is also, by the way, the period of the Decretum Gratiani that we made lots of videos on, that sort of opens a bit to a much more documented phase of ecclesiastical, of canon law essentially, and of, at that point, like very well-known tradition. It was still living, juridically speaking, in the Papal States, in the Church. Here, again, the guy was an oratorian himself from Rome. I also made a video about Saint Philip Neri in the same period. This is when the tradition of the pilgrimage to the 7 churches of Rome was established. We are in full post-Reformation. This is the same years of the 80 Years' War. The very beautiful times where, Spain was hegemonic in these regions, where there was a broader Catholic effort that we documented also recently in that video about the Knights of Malta. So again, contextualize, right? If you ask a random person why the 12th century as a stopping point, if you have never heard of the Decretum Gratiani, what it is about, you will never understand that. And again, you can check out my videos if you have difficulties of finding but an 8 minutes long video trying to explain what the Decretum Gratiani is without explaining to you this stuff, right? Investiture controversy, all interconnected, including, again, lay and ecclesiastical history and law. And this was typical Western civilization. They always go in parallel. They cannot be separated, all right? Until it happened, because, again, tradition was abated, right, by hatchet hits, and that was not really nice, right? With, the Code Napoleon and the state, at least in civil law, is the sole source of law itself. And the oratorian Baronius would, by the way, be able to write his Annales Ecclesiastici, so making a proper history of what happened before the Decretum, as he had access to the Vatican archives, among others. Just imagine what Renaissance Rome actually was. Botero's descriptions are quite eloquent. It's obvious, by the way, that in Baronius' context, his work served as a Catholic counterpoint to the critical history of the Church over the centuries, compiled in the preceding decades from a Lutheran perspective by the so-called Centuriators of Magdeburg that are incredibly famous. The name Centuriator comes from the fact that their analytic style proceeded century by century, so 100 year after 100 year, centum being the Latin etymology. And these Centuriators, by the way, were incredibly radical, right? While I would like to stress this is why Catholic civilization at this point, by the way, was still pretty well placed historically wise. Again, most of the Protestant world was particularly backward compared still to the Mediterranean, to Western Europe, to the tendentially Catholic powers of France, of Spain. The ideological fanaticism of the Reformation had brought to create viciously aggressive narratives, right? Imagine you are literally expounding tradition and telling a story of the world and how things, if anything, even just making it a point to explain, trying to historically research what happened, right? And the Catholics were pretty straightforward. I mean, the donation of Constantine was debunked by a papal humanist just for explaining you how these gotcha moments that people very much like, especially today's on the internet, do not reveal the complete lack of any context in any depth of how, for example, the same Catholic civilization would be able to fully contextualize Constantine's the false that I remember how Lorenzo Valla's title really was, but it was pretty straightforward, explicit. It was not hidden. It was not a conspiracy over saying all the terrible things like the evil popes of whatever they did. We're talking about Valla, that was yet another great humanist. We're talking straightforwardly that the most educated people in Europe were pretty open about this. They were trying literally to explain history, and the so-called Constantine's donation, by the way, has an incredibly interesting history. It's not merely a piece of made-up stuff that was randomly used for backing an otherwise undefensible position, as most people fundamentally believe. It has an incredibly fascinating origin and also pretty convoluted, in fact, story up to the point of arrival as it was held, and as we've seen at this point, still within a fully unapologetically Catholic world, absolutely accepted by the same. Just for telling you the difference in the scale of civilization and what this was all about. Catholic history did not really express this level of, we could say, deconstructionism, of iconoclasm, that literally the Protestants were destroying statues, relics, stealing church property, killing monks, nuns. I mean, we've seen this also in the video about, for example, the 80 Years' War. This is not a good, positive narrative. It's as if, again, literally the 12th century heretics had prevailed, and also through radical fringes, by the way. As you know, the Nassaus themselves, like Henry the Silent, were the predilects of the Catholic rulers like Philip II. They were Catholic themselves. If anything, they instrumentalized that. Right? Why did Henry VIII, decide to confiscate monastic possessions in England? Right? There were practical reasons. You can't say these weren't sort of competent rulers, but they were still doing so from evidently a miserable and fringe position regarding the potential, at least, of a unified Catholic civilization with the Turks at the gates, and with literally these Protestant powers sabotaging the Habsburgic effort to gain benefits for themselves. This is an incredibly serious issue. Like, this is not something you can escape by saying, okay, I was raised Protestant, I believe in this, okay, fine. Let's respect the liberty in that. But not posing oneself historical questions and defending a picture that is not merely, again, that they killed the monks or the nuns, that paradoxically, even in traditional terms, one of the least aspects of it all, because it's so straightforwardly evil that you don't even need to reflect on it. But the question is, how did it come to be? Like, sin starts from the mind, and it's in the mind that you have to enter. Like, people like Calvin literally said that humanity was completely worthless, and literally citing Calvin. Calvin stated that it's not like, God in comparison to humanity is so infinite that humanity is enough. No, literally stated that in absolute terms, humanity is zero, right? Do you understand what this means, even just from a psychological point of view? That's where essentially mainstream Protestantism stemmed from. What the heck is, today these ideologies are mostly like in the left. I mean, they have always been in the left, for that matter. The way, paradoxically, historiography through the centuries of Magdeburg were able to flip it, to insult, to denigrate, to desecrate Rome, not just even in, just the papacy, but the entire concept of a unified Catholic empire, a universal rule, a united Christian world that could fight collectively against the Turk, regaining the Holy Land, right, creating a better place for truly the same foundation of civilization was disrupted in this. And we can't really see it in another perspective. Before, by the way, I mentioned Philip Neri, and this is exactly the context where Baronius, again, I made a video about the basilicas of Rome. Check that out because it's very important. The Jubilees, the establishment of the Jubilee under Boniface VIII and the pilgrimage to the 7 churches. That this is also the year of the Jubilee. You're in time, like you haven't gone to Rome yet, to do so, right? Baronius was born in 1538 in Sora, which is a town near to Rome, and trained in law before joining the oratory of the very Saint Philip Neri, who, by the way, was frankly an innovator. There were many Catholics that did not like, for example, the joyful, playful side of Christian popular celebration that Neri encouraged, and that turned to be pretty actually accepted in positive outcome, right? And obviously the same Baronius was driven by a Counter-Reformation zeal to defend Catholic Orthodoxy. In doing so, I would like to stress, in reconstructing the past, right? I think this is crucial when you wonder how Schwerpunkt works in many ways. How do you counter the present? By addressing the present, you have already lost with that. You must absolutely address the past. That is much more clarificatory. It's much bigger. It's much more meaningful than anything that could be seen in a fallen world, right? And Baronius' close ties to the Vatican and mentorship under Filippo Neri shaped his meticulous approach as well in this, because if you study history, you must, again, create a foundation out of nothing. This is not like a laboratory experiment where everything is prepared and already given for granted. With history, you must be able to interpret it in a way that makes sense as reality, but without an actual foundation in a broader sense, or at least in terms of given limits, etc. And this makes you confront with the divine, makes you confront with the actual objectiveness of the reconstruction. Things must make sense, right? They can't just be set by some random approach, nor they can be limited by some relative factors. You must be able to handle reality in and of itself in order for it to be that effective, all right? Using archival documents, also in this case, Baronius constructed a narrative that not only countered Protestant critiques, but also aimed to establish the Church's historical legacy as a divinely guided institution. This is, again, pretty straightforwardly introductory lesson to Medievistics. We stopped essentially to the Italian Renaissance and humanism. We will talk later about the French tradition. Then I don't know with how much other scanning, through which other scanning we will pass to probably up to Muratori, right? And we will arrive up to, I would say, the French Revolution. That seems a very good scanning because the French and Muratori are, again, this is very interesting. The Muratori is the true founder of what we intend mostly as modern, conventionally at least modern Medievistics, right? And he was a guy literally dedicating his works. He was a clergyman as well. He made a work that today nobody's able to do, would never be able to do, absolutely, with the means of the time. Writing and, say, publishing his works as a gift to Charles VI, Maria Theresia, as a loyal imperial subject, right, of modern as well. We've seen this also with Sigonius, for telling you how persistent, also in the modern age, of course, historical and historiographical advancement was in a country, again, like Italy, that was a bit the source of it all. In Roman terms, obviously enough. But again, I'm very glad to have covered this topic, because I didn't imagine it could give me the possibility to tell so much about the world and how meaningful, of course, medievistics can be when you truly realize its implications, right? And again, when I make these videos, the first thing I say to me, like, I have to make sense, all right? This is not about my perspective, other than the fact that I'm the vessel of something that is evidently here. At least I see it, right? I don't know if you see it too, if you have any other point, if you have any other consideration to make, but I don't think we can very much circle too long around the fact that this is a heavy topic, one that literally made history at the time, and therefore provided, because this is what we're talking about, different narratives from different parts of Europe. And this already obviously cannot correspond to a scientific method, nor a moral standard to begin with, and the two things always go in parallel. So it's not a matter of opinion. There's only one truth, right? Doesn't matter how, again, we fall short of that and therefore have different opinions. There's always to be, as a consequence, a better opinion and a worse opinion. Maybe if you dissect it, of course, there are better elements in the worse opinion to a degree, to a minor degree, of course, and vice versa. But there is no doubt, like, you cannot make moral confusion about this. You cannot pretend this to be some kind of random guess, right? You must be extremely careful about it. And you have to be, if anything, honest and responsible towards what you're doing and saying. As you also have understood today, we have not talked about, I don't know, some broader literature. We're talking literally historiography. We haven't talked about Machiavelli, for example, right? And it's obvious that also in authors like him, you can find a lot, even about historiographical views, even when these were not really considered as central. Or, again, we remember Machiavelli for having written about political theory, the art of war, all right? Obviously, through him, you can get a lot through his times, right? The Renaissance, some sort of modernized view that, however, is still in line with an important level of traditional understanding. But when we talk about properly history of historiography, we must narrow it down to some contemporaries that, as you have understood here, whose life intertwined with the one of very important people and figures that tell you how literally this is not some random character you've never heard of, separated, detached from any other thing that you understand. It's very easy to just also gnoseologically single things out, because it seems as if this was just more, it was just easier, right? It made it easier to understand in a general sense. Things worked in ways that are always and constantly intertwined. This is what history literally teaches you, right? And it can't really be understood otherwise, all right? It's extremely important. It can't be forgotten, and we must be extremely careful about it all. Hence, I probably take, I don't know how much. This is, I think, today we made something like, I don't know about this. I don't know how much we're going to, maybe 4 or 5 videos. That is, I think, how much we're gonna get towards. Even though, again, I don't know how much we could get to war with this stuff. It would be beautiful, naturally, to make this all much longer than expected. Let's say, Okay, I will see this. I have to decide it because there are also other factors here. I'm just barely taking into consideration. Very well. Anyhow, for today, I really stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.